So Donald Trump just surrendered to Canada. Not a renegotiation, not a compromise, not a strategic repositioning or a mutual de-escalation or a face-saving agreement dressed up in language designed to disguise who won and who lost. A surrender after 18 months of tariffs, sanctions, demands, insults, threats, and the full economic weight of the most powerful nation on earth directed at a country on a tenth its size. The President of the United States walked to a podium in the White House briefing room, read from a prepared text. He did not deviate from by a single word and conceded virtually every position he had taken since the confrontation began. Every tariff on Canadian goods removed. The demand that Prime Minister Carney resign formally, publicly, explicitly withdrawn. The demand for control of Canadian ports withdrawn. The demand for $350 billion in Canadian uranium withdrawn. The pressure on Canadian copper pricing withdrawn. The bilateral framework that will govern the relationship going forward, negotiated on Canadian terms reflecting Canadian priorities, structured around Canadian sovereignty over Canadian resources. 18 months of escalation, 11 major confrontations, the most aggressive campaign of economic coercion directed at a Democratic ally in the post-World War II era, ended not with a deal, but with a capitulation so total that the White House press corps sat in stunned silence for 4 seconds after the president finished speaking before a single question was asked. But here's what happened in the 12 hours before that podium. Because Trump did not choose this. This was not a strategic decision reached after careful deliberation. 12 hours before the announcement, his own cabinet was in open revolt. The Secretary of the Treasury reportedly shouted across the Situation Room table. The Secretary of Energy submitted a letter of resignation that was talked back only after the decision to surrender was confirmed. The Secretary of Defense told the President in front of the entire national security team that the uranium supply crisis constituted a threat to military readiness that he could not in good conscience remain silent about. And the White House Chief of Staff, the person whose job it is to protect the President's political interests above all else, told Trump that if the confrontation continued through the winter, the party would lose both chambers of Congress in the midterms by margins that would make governance impossible for the remaining 2 years of the term. The cabinet didn't advise surrender. The cabinet made continuation impossible. Warren Buffett called it the most comprehensive strategic defeat of a major power by a middle power in modern economic history. And then he delivered what may be the definitive analysis of these 18 months, not of what went wrong at the end, but of why the ending was visible from the very beginning to anyone who understood the difference between power and sustainability. When you hear what Carney's final counter move was, the one that landed on top of 18 months of compounding crisis and broke the administration's will to continue what happened inside that cabinet room in the 12 hours before the surrender, what Trump actually conceded, and what it cost the United States to get back things it had thrown away with its own hands. And what Buffett says this teaches every leader who will ever hold power about the difference between starting fights and winning them. You'll understand why this isn't just the end of the U.S.-Canada confrontation. This is the moment the world learned that economic size does not guarantee strategic victory, and that the most dangerous opponent is not the one who hits hardest, but the one who removes your options while you're busy swinging. Hit subscribe, because the global implications of what just happened will reshape international relations for a generation. Let me take you through the counter move that finally broke the White House, because this wasn't just another retaliation in a 1 8-month series of retaliations. This was a permanent structural change to the economic architecture of the Western Hemisphere, one that made the confrontation not just painful to continue, but literally unsurvivable. 3 days before the cabinet meltdown, Mark Carney stood in the House of Commons and announced the formation of the Canadian Strategic Resource Authority, the CSR, a sovereign national entity that consolidated every Canadian strategic export under a single institutional framework with the legal authority to set pricing, select buyers, impose conditions, and exclude any nation deemed hostile to Canadian economic or security interests: oil, natural gas, electricity, uranium, copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium, potash, rare earth elements, timber, hydroelectric power, every strategic commodity that Canada exports. And Canada is the world's leading or top 5 producer of nearly all of them, was placed under the control of a single authority with the power to turn the tap off on any or all of them for any buyer at any time for any reason. The CSR was not framed as a retaliatory measure. It was framed as a permanent reform of Canadian resource governance, a structural change that would remain in place regardless of who was president in Washington, regardless of whether the confrontation was resolved, regardless of any future diplomatic normalization. Canada was not threatening to weaponize its resources. Canada was institutionalizing the weapon permanently, irrevocably, with legislation that passed the House of Commons unanimously, 338 votes to 0 for the second time in the confrontation. The markets understood the implications before the political analysts did. Within 90 minutes of Carney's announcement, West Texas Intermediate crude jumped 6%. Natural gas futures spiked 11%. Uranium spot prices, already elevated from the supply contract redirection, climbed another 9%. Copper, nickel, and lithium futures all rose by between 4 and 7%. The S&P 500 fell 2.8% in a single trading session, the worst single-day decline linked to the Canadian confrontation. Goldman Sachs issued an emergency client note that described the CSR as the most significant structural change to North American commodity markets since NAFTA, and warned that the risk premium for any American supply chain with Canadian exposure had permanently increased. The CSR didn't just threaten the American economy, it restructured the rules of the game so that Canada held a permanent institutional advantage in any future negotiation over any strategic commodity. It was, as one former U.S. trade representative said, the equivalent of your supplier building a vault around everything you buy from them and handing the key to a committee you have no influence over. But the CSR didn't land in a vacuum. It landed on top of 18 months of compounding crisis, none of which had been resolved, all of which were still bleeding, and every one of which had made the American position weaker, more expensive, and more politically unsustainable with every passing week. The tariffs that started the confrontation had cost American consumers an estimated $47 billion in higher prices across every category of Canadian import, from lumber that increased housing costs to auto parts that raised vehicle prices to agricultural products that hit grocery bills in border states. The energy suspension had plunged Michigan, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Maine into declared energy emergencies, with power grid operators activating contingency protocols and warning of rolling blackouts during peak demand periods. Natural gas prices in the Midwest had doubled. Heating oil futures reached levels not seen in over a decade. Families in New England faced winter heating bills that consumed a quarter of their monthly income. The diplomatic severance, the first in 158 years of continuous relations, had created logistical chaos along the world's longest shared border, visa processing suspended, consular services eliminated, cross-border commerce involving any government-facilitated process, permits, inspections, certifications disrupted or halted entirely. The 5,500-mile frontier that had been undefended for over a century was now operating in a diplomatic void. The airspace closure had cost American Airlines over $3 billion annually in rerouting, adding hours to transatlantic flights, and creating cascading delays at every international hub on the eastern seaboard. The port refusal had exposed American trade dependency on Canadian infrastructure and redirected shipping capacity to non-American partners through long-term agreements that locked in the realignment. The copper tariffs had doubled wire cost and crushed 47,000 electrical contracting jobs. David Kowalski in Grand Rapids was still sitting at his kitchen table, still doing math that didn't work, still unable to afford the copper wire he needed to do his job. The Bordeaux joke had shattered the perception of American dominance in front of every allied leader on earth. 200 million views, the most shared political clip in social media history. The 5 words I gently suggest he stopped, still trending months later. The uranium checkmate had locked American nuclear fuel into contracts with other nations for the next 2 decades. 93 reactors generating 20% of American electricity now facing supply uncertainty that the Pentagon had classified as a threat to military readiness. And the worker insult had emptied construction sites across 6 states, cost the industry $8 billion in the first year alone, and sent 37,000 of the most skilled tradespeople in the Western Hemisphere home to Canada with signing bonuses funded by the very tariffs America had imposed. None of these crises were one-time events. They were ongoing. They were compounding. The energy costs were accumulating every month. The construction jobs weren't coming back. The uranium contracts weren't reversible. The workers weren't returning. Every month, the confrontation continued. The damage deepened, and the political viability of sustaining it eroded further. The CSRA was not the crisis that broke the administration. The CSR was the last straw placed on a pile of straws that had been accumulating for 18 months. It was the final weight on a structure that was already collapsing under the combined mass of every previous miscalculation. And when the full weight of what the CSR meant, combined with everything that had come before, reached the cabinet room, something inside the administration broke. The emergency cabinet meeting was convened at 6:00 inches of the evening and scheduled for 90 minutes. It lasted 5 hours. By the end, the President of the United States was sitting at the head of a table surrounded by people he had appointed, people who had defended him through every previous crisis, people whose careers were tied to his, and every single one of them was telling him it was over. The Treasury Secretary presented a classified economic assessment prepared over the preceding 72 hours. The assessment showed that if the confrontation continued through the winter with the CSR, in effect, GDP contraction in the first quarter would reach an estimated 1.4%, 4% the first negative GDP quarter since the pandemic. Unemployment in construction, energy, and manufacturing would reach levels not seen since the financial crisis. In the account described by multiple participants, the decisive turning point in the 8-month economic confrontation did not arrive as a single dramatic event, but as the accumulation of pressure that gradually removed every viable policy option from the table. By the time the final emergency cabinet meeting was convened, the situation had shifted from political strategy to arithmetic constraints that officials in the room repeatedly described as irreversible. Senior Treasury officials opened the briefing with projections showing that consumer energy prices in several U.S. border and northern states had already crossed thresholds historically associated with severe electoral backlash. The analysis suggested that another quarter of sustained disruption could push inflationary pressure in heating and industrial energy far beyond politically sustainable levels. One official summarized the situation bluntly. The economy was not reacting to policy preferences anymore, but to physical constraints in supply. The Energy Secretary followed with a classified assessment of grid stability and fuel availability heading into winter. According to contingency models, rolling blackouts were now a credible scenario across multiple states if Canadian energy imports were not restored in time. Natural gas reserves had fallen to their lowest seasonal levels in nearly a decade. The Department of Energy's worst-case planning scenarios indicated that rationing protocols last seen in the 1970s would need to be reactivated if supply conditions did not stabilize before peak demand. Tensions in the room intensified further when defense officials delivered their evaluation of nuclear fuel and strategic supply chains. The briefing reframed what had begun as a trade dispute into a readiness issue. The Defense Secretary reportedly told the President that the uranium supply structure supporting both civilian nuclear reactors and naval propulsion systems was under strain, with key assumptions about reliable sourcing no longer valid. His conclusion was stark. He could not certify to Congress that strategic deterrence readiness remained unaffected. The implication was not rhetorical, it was institutional. The Commerce Department then presented a cumulative domestic impact report that outlined cascading economic disruption. Hundreds of thousands of jobs were either lost, suspended, or indirectly affected across construction, energy, logistics, and manufacturing sectors. Billions in delayed infrastructure investment had begun to ripple through local economies. Hospitals postponed expansion projects, School districts deferred upgrades, and major industrial development shifted toward alternative markets. The data painted a picture not of isolated shocks, but of systemic reorientation in trade and investment flows. Political advisors layered on top of this an increasingly bleak electoral forecast. Internal polling indicated that the confrontation had become one of the dominant concerns among swing state voters. Midterm projections showed substantial risk of losses in both chambers of Congress. One senior strategist, according to accounts from multiple attendees, delivered a warning that cut through the technical language. The country could absorb policy failure or economic downturn independently, but not both simultaneously, alongside